show you now is how to sharpen a straight bladed knife. This is a Woodlander that we make, 4-inch blade with the classic flat Norwegian grind. So that's what we're going to show you how to sharpen. The setup that I tend to use is actually again using sandpaper. These are some semi-worn out belts that I use on the belt sanders for shaping the knife handles. This is actually a 240 grit aluminium oxide belt, so if I actually dismantle it you'll see how it's made. Alright, so the main part is a piece of wood, doesn't really matter what it is. This is a piece of ash, it's about 1 inch in thickness. You've got to make sure that you use something relatively thick, otherwise it will actually bend when you actually start tensioning the belt up. I've cut these to pretty much the same width as the belts that I'm using, and the only other thing that I use, because I tend to use it a hell of a lot, is I actually use this stuff, which is actually called corian. It's a synthetic stone that I got from a friend who fitted kitchen work surfaces. If you can't find corian, you can find micarta, fairly readily available now through most knife supply companies. The great thing about this is it stays truly flat, whereas if you use it a lot you'll tend to wear the wood itself. With the corian, all I've done is I've actually radiused the corners off this edge so that it actually matches the ricasso area of my knife. If you leave it dead square, it has a tendency to sort of cut a very steep channel in the actual blade itself. So I'll put it back together again, slide on the corian, slide on our belt. I try and always avoid using the actual splice of the belt. I normally put that at the end. But what I can do with this is I can slide in these little simple inch blocks and pull those away like that, and that just tensions that belt up. The great thing about using a belt as opposed to a flat sheet of sandpaper is as soon as this wears or you nick it with your knife, you can just slacken your chocks and actually just rotate it round. The only thing to think about is when you make these chocks, it's actually an advantage if you make them the same thickness rather than just using scraps of timber, because you can actually use it flat on the bench and it doesn't rock. What I tend to do in the workshop environment is I actually tend to place this in a vise so that it's a very comfortable height. With all work, if you can try and keep yourself comfortable, the actual job itself tends to be a lot more straightforward. So we'll just adjust this. So we'll just drift that over the edge and then tension the belt by pushing the blocks away. Now with sandpaper, with use it tends to clog up. The great thing I found that works really well is you can buy these abrasive cleaners. It's effectively just a big rubber, and you can then rub the surface of your abrasive with that. It cleans out any clogged up material and allows you to keep using that same belt just a little bit longer. Just clean off the rubber. The main thing that you've got to ensure when you're using these is to keep the surface wet. If you use them dry, you tend to wear out the surface of the sandpaper quicker, but more than anything there is a danger of actually scorching your cutting edge. So I tend to use an old drinks bottle. If you buy spring water these days it comes in a handy little drinks bottle as well. So I'll wet that surface down. The water is actually going to make the job easier as well. It's not a bad idea if you're working in bad light conditions to get yourself a little angle poised lamp. Light is almost essential when you're sharpening. So the first thing I tend to do when I'm sharpening is I actually assess the edge itself. So I have a look at it, see if I've got any major nicks in it, see if I've damaged it, if I've hit knots or bits of grit, and I have just a little bit of a look at it. I tend to tilt it into the light, whether it be the angle poise or sunlight, and see if I can see any light or flat spots bouncing back at me. And if I can, that's probably going to be the trouble areas that I need to spend a bit more time on. Just as we did before in the other video, I'm going to use the marker pen again to colour in those bevels. Not the blade itself, but just the bevels, and that's going to show us if we're actually on the bevel itself or if we're leaning either too far back or too far forward. So as a learning medium, I think this works really good. So you can see we've just coloured in both those bevels now. So now you've coloured those bevels in, just make sure that that surface of the stone is nice and wet. And then I tend to do the left hand edge first, so that's going to be the one that I'm pushing away from me. Just to make sure that you get the correct angle, the stance that I tend to use is I actually lay the knife onto the surface so that it's absolutely dead flat, and then tilt it progressively up until it hits that bevel. And what you'll see is when the bevel hits the stone and becomes dead flat, it will squirt that water out from underneath it. So you've got almost a visual indicator that you're flat on that bevel. I'm holding the ricasso tight up to the edge of my belt because we want to try and get it as sharp right up to this part of the blade. This is where you're going to get the most leverage when you're carving. So we want to make sure we sharpen the whole length. Once you've got that kind of grip, we've got this edge coming pretty much square across the face of the belt. I tend to put the fingers of my left hand just on the edge of the blade itself, and I can get a lot of response from that, a lot of feel. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and push the blade along the surface of the stone, along the surface of the sandpaper, almost slicing that wave of water off the actual surface of the sandpaper. So all the way along. Now it's entirely up to you whether you just concentrate on the push stroke and then lift off, bring it back to the edge of the stone and continue the same process. What I tend to do is do it back and forth. Obviously if you're learning, you might find that it's best to concentrate on that, just that push stroke, because you'll find that you won't have a tendency to round the bevel so much. So if we just do a little bit of that, almost straight away you'll see if we're doing a proper job, we've removed all the pen from that bevel and we've removed it all in one flat section. If I'd only removed a little bit from the back edge of the bevel, that would have meant that I was leaning slightly too far back, and obviously if we'd have only removed it from the very cutting edge itself, we'd have been leaning too far forward. So the main thing with trying to sharpen these flat bladed knives is to ensure that flat bevel. So I'll go back and do a little bit more on there. So you can just see every now and again I just check to see if that bead of water squirts out from underneath that bevel. And you can see how I'm pushing quite tight up against the sandpaper itself, allowing the sandpaper to drift into that ricasso area. The thing to be aware of is not to let your finger drift off the cutting edge. You won't cut yourself, but after a few progressive sharpens you'll find that you'll wear the skin off the end of your finger. So keep it tucked in into the blade.